Welcome to Shaken Not Burned, a cocktail of solutions for a sustainable future. I'm Felicia Jackson.
And I am Giulia Bottaro. Each week we interview experts to talk about parts of the sustainable transition and what you and your business need to know to succeed.
Sustainability is complex and constantly evolving, and it can be hard for a business to adapt and remain competitive.
We are here to help you learn all about the changing economy and the ongoing transition.
So join us as we explore the concepts and the tools you need to plot a course for a sustainable future. Hello and welcome to the latest episode of Shaken Not Burned, where we explore the ideas, people and technologies shaping a more sustainable future. Today we're going to be talking about one of the most overlooked but absolutely essential materials in modern life, cement. So it's responsible for about 8% of global CO2 emissions, but we can't build without it. That means development doesn't happen without it. So how do we go about decarbonising carbon at scale without slowing down infrastructure and development? So joining me today is Grant Quasha, Chief Executive of Eco-Material Technologies, the largest supplier of supplementary cementitious materials in North America. Their work spans everything from cleaning up legacy coal ash to supplying greener alternatives for today's concrete. So we're going to be talking about policy, power demand, carbon tariffs, AI data centers, and basically the future of construction itself. So welcome to the show, Grant. Perhaps you could start us off by telling us a little bit about you, your journey, and Eco-Materials.
Sure. Thank you very much, Felicia, for having me. Appreciate the time here to talk about what we're trying to do to grow our footprint and help the world as well at the same time. My journey is one that's come through a number of different ventures in the commodity space. I've worked in mining, in steel, and now in construction materials. And over the last 5 years or so have, through a number of different activities, including some acquisitions and mergers and organic growth, taken what is Eco-Material now to, as you noted, the largest supplier of supplementary cementitious materials in North America. And supplementary cementitious materials is a big set of words, but just basically means that we're using much lower and sometimes zero carbon alternatives to Portland cement, which is the traditional, more highly polluting material. It's the binder that makes the concrete work. It is, however, quite emissions intensive. So our focus is to take lower value, often waste materials from industrial processes and natural minerals as well to reduce the amount of highly polluting Portland cement you need in your concrete mixture.
So basically what you're talking about is this is a means for the construction industry as a whole to actually be able to continue to develop infrastructure as they want, but in a way that has a much lower footprint.
Correct. And many of these materials have been in use for decades. And so It is a proven technology and it is at scale. So that is a great thing in a business that frankly moves reasonably slowly. And it's really the most efficient way to reduce the emissions impact. And the other benefit as well here is that these materials actually make the concrete stronger and last longer. So you get a better concrete. Often you can save money. And in many cases, especially with our newer projects, we're cleaning up old waste sites. So you get a triple benefit.
Okay, now you see, that sounds like a no-brainer to someone who's not an expert in the area because everybody wants to save money. Nobody likes waste, and cleaning things up can only be a good thing. So that sort of then makes me want to take a little step back and look at the wider picture, because obviously there's a lot of change going on in terms of ESG pushback, in terms of a changing perspective on carbon emissions, especially in the North American market. And one of the things that I find particularly fascinating is this idea that a business like yours sits between sustainability and domestic manufacturing. So it's almost uniquely positioned in terms of these two very polar drivers or seemingly different focus points for the US economy. Is that sort of positioning something you see as beneficial going forward? Or, what's your view of the situation as we stand today?
Sure. I think the great thing about our business is that it doesn't particularly matter who's in charge of the government because we can provide value no matter what your priorities are. So as you noted, it is sort of a no-brainer. We're able to supply material that if you're really focused on domestic manufacturing and on lowering costs and increasing the quality of infrastructure, perhaps like the current administration is, we provide that. If you're really focused on decarbonization, we provide that. Our business model is not predicated on getting any type of a green premium for our products. If we do get that, that's great. However, we need to be competitive against the traditional alternatives, because in a situation like you have today, we're not going to get a leg up from the government or from some sort of price on carbon. This is a environment that is very much focused on other things, and that's okay for us. I view our value proposition as really, apolitical. Everybody wants good quality infrastructure at the right cost, and if it can be green too, excellent.
Are you seeing any shifts in investor or consumer conversations? I realize it's been a relatively short space of time, but are you seeing a shift in the conversation? Because I think for me, one of the things that looks very interesting is the conversation is changing, but not necessarily the requirements. As you say, it's this issue about wanting something that is at least as cheap, if not cheaper, than what's an already established market. Are you seeing a change in the language or a change in appetite?
Yeah, I think it's really just a change more in the language, right? It's the way in which companies and ourselves maybe are advertising ourselves. Our name is Eco Material Technology, so we're not getting around the fact that it's an eco-friendly product that we sell. That said, we can focus on certain attributes more in different environments and less in certain environments. And so if we're talking to Washington today, we would focus on the fact that, you want to stimulate domestic manufacturing. We're doing that. We are investing close to $500 million in new sustainable sources of basically green enabled manufacturing of these types of products. And that is American jobs. That is American supply chains, which is very attractive to the current administration, especially when you consider the broader context, which is in North America, we haven't really manufactured a significant amount of new cement production or SCM production in the last 20 years. All of the incremental material for the last 20 years has really come from imports. And so, especially in today's very volatile tariff environment, a lot of those materials are coming from Asia. They're coming from Vietnam. They're coming from China. And these materials are, from our perspective, far less efficient than if we can produce them here more efficiently and, frankly, more environmentally responsibly. That might not be a big focus of the current administration, but I always like to say the only thing more environmentally damaging than making Portland cement in the United States is making it in China and then shipping it all the way to the United States, right? So what we can offer in today's environment is, really a tangible alternative to that, and one that we think is, cost advantaged, environmentally advantaged, and better for domestic manufacturing.
That, you see, this again speaks to some of the conversations I've been having. There's obviously a lot of disruption around what is actually going to happen with the tariffs, where they're going to end up, who they're actually going to affect, at what level. But there has been a sort of growing conversation about the potential for, if there was a major trade war, it would actually focus many countries on building up domestic supply chains, and that would actually build appetite for many greener, certainly more sustainable businesses and technologies. Do you see the potential or a potential for tariffs and even potential carbon border adjustment mechanisms as just been launched in Europe to actually provide an edge to domestic markets? Or do you think they're just an additional complexity that's actually just having a dangerous effect on what are already tight margins in many industries?
Right. Now, I do think in our industry, it's absolutely beneficial. My view on tariffs are, generally, I'm not a huge supporter of it. But in many cases, the concept of the fact that we're going to, move manufacturing of iPhones onto American soil strikes me as a bit far-fetched. That said, in the construction materials industry, it really is as simple as today, there's 1 million tons of Vietnamese cement coming into the West Coast, and it's, you can argue whether or not it's being dumped, but it's coming in at very low costs, and it's competing with some new projects that we're starting that have the ability to ramp up and take that capacity away. In a tariff environment, there's going to be a direct correlation to our ability to ramp domestic production, increase local jobs, and decrease the environmental impact of that specific set of materials. And so there really is a one-for-one benefit for domestic green manufacturing in many cases to a tariff environment. Like you said, the cross-border adjustment mechanism in Europe is a tariff of a different sort, if you will, right? It's a tariff it's a greener tariff, right? And so again, we don't currently have any operations in Europe, but it should act as a way to stimulate increased investment in greener production in Europe. And we're seeing that. And, over time, we may eventually participate in that market. And one of the reasons why we may participate in that market is because the regulations around the CBAM are such that it creates a more attractive economic environment for folks like ourselves.
Excellent. Now, we've spoken before about one of the important things is actually the potential to unlock value in landfilled coal ash. Basically, essentially this idea that we've got about 100 years of waste buried in the ground all over the country, and this could potentially be turned into whatever, a couple of 100 years of cleaner concrete. Do you see that still as being a sort of opportunity? And is it going to be the technology, the policy framework, or basic economics that is going to drive that action? I'm particularly interested because of the current rhetoric around the need for coal.
Sure. Absolutely. That's our biggest growth area. We have 4 harvesting facilities that are currently up and running today, one in Pennsylvania, one in Georgia, one in Texas, and one in Florida. We have an incremental 4 that are coming online within the next 12 months. And that's where we're seeing the largest amount of growth in our business. And frankly, as you noted, there is a push with the current administration to, save coal, extend coal, what have you. We don't burn coal. We just repurpose the waste. So we sort of stay out of that part of it. That said, the nice thing about the current administration is that there is the ability to talk rationally about regulations around repurposing this waste. The previous administration, while very focused on obviously ESG efforts, when we would talk about what we do, some people would just get hung up with the fact that it has something to do with coal, right? Even though it's coal waste and we're trying to clean up an old problem, you mention the coal word and the conversation stops. And so to enhance the amount of this harvesting that's going to occur really requires 2 things, one of which is more investment and more technology, and we're doing that, and others are doing that as well. And the second is common sense regulations. So the group in the U.S. that oversees these types of facilities and these dumps is the Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA. And they've historically had some regulations around these that have made it perhaps a little bit more difficult to do the harvesting. And we are hopeful that with the current administration and the desire to take on the coal issue head on and not be concerned about whatever potential, PR ramifications come out of it, we think there's a lot more opportunity to get more common sense regulation associated with these dumps so that we can accelerate the amount of work that we're doing there. And so I think that's a real positive that's come out of the administration change.
So I think what I'm taking away from that is that it is a really positive thing to be able to have conversations that were difficult to have beforehand, but that you're not taking a position one way or the other on an increased use of coal. Because PR-wise or emissions-wise or whichever, it is a challenging area. And I think people have very, very different views on what's going on. But if there is 100 years of waste that needs to be sorted out and there's a means of doing it, it seems like common sense to actually just deal with it.
Absolutely. The waste issue is independent of how long these plants are going to continue to run. And frankly, if you want to build new ones, I personally don't think they're going to. Who knows? Never say never. Stranger things have happened. So we stay out of that piece. That said, I do have the view, and we might get into it in a little bit, that these plants will stay open a lot longer than people are expecting. You're starting to see retirements deferred. It's not necessarily just because of the administration and the loosening of regulations, although that's part of it. Most of it is just driven by pure supply and demand, which is just there's so much growing demand for power in the United States, primarily driven by AI and data centers, that you just can't meet the demand requirements while you're retiring a lot of fossil generation.
That to me is an area where there really does need to be a huge amount of debate and discussion, because we've seen this once in a generation spike in power demand because of the growth of AI data centers. But at the same time, I've also seen things like major tech companies actually cutting development projects for new data centers, because was it DeepMind that came out using 1/10 of the previous amount of energy that was required? So, I mean, I'm interested in your views on what you actually think is going to be happening with the data center market. Do you think that this is a significant market shift in demand growth, or is this a spike because of a particular technology deployment?
Sure. First of all, I think, I'm no expert in AI. I have my own views. I do think that Perhaps the most optimistic expectations of data center demand and power demand are perhaps a little bit overstated and are starting to come in. You're starting to see some folks like Microsoft pull out of some projects. DeepSeek, like you mentioned, theoretically, you might be able to do this with less power. That said, I think still, even if you cut those projections in half, there still is a yawning gap between what we can supply from a power perspective and what the demand will be. Frankly, even without AI, it was going to be a reasonably close thing to retire all these fossil generating facilities and bring in solar and wind and other sources more environmentally responsible and not have a hiccup. In certain markets like Texas, you already had in the last couple of years, even before AI became a real thing, you already had issues around reliability, blackouts, et cetera, because peak power demand was already growing. So there's already an issue, there's a base issue, and then the AI is really just the fuel on the fire. And so I don't know if there's going to be 2 gallons of fuel thrown on the fire or one. I don't think it's going to be zero. And if it's not zero, then we have a fundamental problem with not enough.
Okay. Now that's again interesting because it leads to a discussion about not just the increase in power demand, but the increasing change of economic demand in different countries, the increasing development that you see in the global south, for example, which also is going to be blunt. We use cement for everything. So there's going to be massive demand for greener forms of cement. And to be blunt, there are lots of technologies in development that do provide greener cement, but they're expensive. So how do you see your role? I mean, do you see yourself very much staying within the US market? Do you see yourself becoming an exporter? How do you see the world shifting when it comes to construction?
Today, we're very happy with where we are. The North American market is a great market. It has strong pricing, historically, very strong demand. I think long-term, we're obviously in a very uncertain period of time today, but I think long-term, very good dynamics from a demographics point of view and from a requirement that, frankly, we have to rehabilitate our crumbling infrastructure anyway. So we're very happy with where we are today. We have a great logistics network already deployed that we're just basically able to bolt our projects onto, which gives us a huge advantage. We look across other geographies as well. The number one gating issue, however, especially to these greener products, is what is the price at which the traditional materials sell, right? In the US, cement, for example, sells somewhere between $120 to $170 a ton. In Europe, it's over 200. And so those are high numbers. And at those numbers, we can make these harvesting projects work and we can continue to sell products at a discount to the traditional materials. You move to India or China, the largest markets for cement and concrete in the world, pricing there is far less. And what that means is it doesn't give you the ability to potentially use a lot of these technologies on a price competitive basis. And so my view is that they will be more slowly adopted in the global south, if you will, than they will be in the more industrialized countries where, you have a higher and a more mature structure from a pricing perspective. Some of that arbitrary, right? You could argue Europe is arbitrarily high because of CBAM, and that's kind of the point, right? Is to raise the price high enough that you incentivize a lot of these new technologies, et cetera. And then you could argue, depending on what happens with tariffs in the US, if we continue to have a big tariff barrier, it's going to do the same thing. And so we look at a lot of opportunities here. And I think over the next several years, we will start to expand. The most natural spot is Europe initially, as I noted, because of its developed nature and its higher prices. But long term, we've looked as far afield as, Korea, South Africa, places like that are, we think, could potentially use our technology and use it effectively.
So the question that springs to mind coming out of that is when you're looking at markets where the price is different and effectively lower, then it becomes more of an issue about the quality and the durability of the material. Because if we're not talking about green premium, we need to be talking about what is special about that material. And because you're upgrading waste, how far can you upgrade waste into a high performance material? Actually work?
Very, very far, depending on how much money you want to spend. So today, I would say, let's take a traditional harvesting project. We'll go in and with our technology, we'll take this stuff that's often been landfilled for 50 years and we'll upgrade it to basically be equivalent to the traditional source of the material, which comes right off the back of the power plant. And so we want to make it equivalent to that. That material will usually replace cement and concrete at around 25, 30%. is kind
Okay.
of the replacement level. Now, that's just the starting point. With our technology, we can take that material and then upgrade it further. We have a very popular product that is called slag, which upgrades it from 30% to 50%, right? Now you're replacing half of the cement in the concrete, which is great. And then we have a product that goes to all the way to 100%. Now that 100% product, that and products like it may be the future. My view is they're the future in 2040, probably not in
Right.
2025, because they're still, that product is more expensive than traditional Portland cement. And while we do sell it and it works great, and it has great performance characteristics, you need to be using it for a specific application or have a very focused green agenda to be able to justify the price for that. So the
Right.
goal is eventually, the way I often think about it is, the concrete evolution has really been a 2,000-year evolution. And we started out 2,000 years ago with the Roman concrete. It was entirely green. And it was very similar to the products that we use today. It was using a volcanic ash, which we mine as one of our products. It was a proto-industrial process, though, very inefficient, but very environmentally responsible. No emissions, essentially. But 200 years ago, Portland cement was invented. That worked much faster, much more efficient, much more cost effective, but high emissions. Now the plan is, how do we use some of those 2,000-year-old materials with upgraded technologies to take what was entirely a black product and eat away at it with more and more green in that. And so now we're getting that black bar down from 100% down to 30%, down to 50%, and eventually trying to get it entirely green again.
I do have to admit, I love the idea of a model that is looking at what happened 2,000 years ago and going, well, this is how we can do something different with that today. Because I think there is something really important about learning lessons from the past and about what we use and how we use them that perhaps is not part of the day-to-day conversation. Because if you're looking for sort of climate breakthroughs, when you're talking about the potential for your 100% product to be the future in 2040, we are talking really decades away. So, do you see with the current environment that there is going to be this growing appetite for green cement, that it is going to actually be able to sort of take over the market? Because one of the issues with construction and the built environment, at least 50% of all buildings we're using now are going to be around in 30 years, probably 40 or 50. So every new thing is going to be around for decades as well. So then it becomes this question of, when is a green breakthrough going to come against the lifetime of the built environment? Do you see that kind of breakthrough anywhere on the horizon? Do you think we need to think about the markets differently? And if so, what do you think we need to do?
Look, I think there's a lot of reasons to be really optimistic. And I think a lot of people will be surprised by how quickly, yes, it's not tomorrow, right? But it's in several years, we've managed to take that bar, which was almost entirely black, and start to green it up. Like I said, the 100% replacement product today, not commercially viable from a pure dollars and cents perspective. But what you do have in the power of combining multiple technologies is you can get most of the way there today. And people are doing this today, which is they'll take products like ours, they'll combine them with other products. The best example I can have is, they'll take our harvested fly ash. They'll take about, let's say we're making 10 tons of concrete here. We need 10 tons of cement. They're going to take 3.5 tons of our product. They'll take 3.5 tons of steel slag, granulated blast furnace slag, which is another SCM that comes out of the steel making process, not the coal process.
So it works for two industries, which we like.
Yep. And they combine them with about 30% cement, and they have what they call a ternary blend, or a 1T blend. And that is 70% decarbonized. And a lot of folks, the folks who are on the front lines of decarbonizing concrete in their projects, are using those today, and they have been using them as far back as 2012. I remember we put material into an office building in San Francisco in 2012 that used a ternary blend at 70%. So this is very possible. Today, people are still mostly using it for foundation work, but over time, it should be able to go up into more and more of the environment. So what you're actually going to see is, I think, a pretty rapid change in the market, and that is through the use of what we call blended cements. And so the cement companies themselves, they're doing this by putting some limestone at the back end of their process to reduce the emissions intensity. Then you can add in SCMs like ours, you can add in SCMs like steel slag. And at the end of the day, you get a product that's actually quite deeply decarbonized. And, I talk to folks who are building data centers, folks who are building office parks and what have you. And a lot of them are saying, that's the baseline. That's what we want to use. And it doesn't matter to them what the environment is from a regulatory perspective. If they can get that blend at a reasonable cost, which they usually can, they're going to do it. And they know that lots of their tenants and customers, whether they're building a data center and it's Google, whether they're building a high-rise building and it's just apartments, people want to see that hopefully these are being built responsibly. And I think you're going to see a lot of progress pretty quickly there. You already have seen it. Most of the cement in the U.S. is now blended. 5 years
Really?
ago, it was less than 10%.
And do you have a figure for how much it is today?
Today, it's well over 50% is blended cements.
So in a very short space of time, it's increased massively, and you expect
Massively.
one of the key questions, obviously, if you're looking for a market to change, is where demand is coming from. And that means, who are your customers? And you talk about developers of office buildings and, companies building data centers. But what you're basically saying is anyone who's building at the moment is pretty much likely to be using blended cement because it's affordable, it's usable, and it makes a great argument for the build.
Absolutely. And they want, in the US, there's if you want what they call LEED, which is environmental certification, platinum status, you need to be doing these types of things to get your certification for your environmentally responsible buildings. At the end of the day, that is not the biggest part of the market. Our biggest market is actually critical infrastructure. So most of our product actually goes into roads and bridges and highways and tunnels and things like that, because our material is required to make sure that those things last a very long time. Those projects are not quite using these more advanced ternary blends yet. But I think over time, that will start to change. And it is starting to change over time. At the end of the day, the end customer there is the government.
Mm-hmm.
And the government cares about performance, and then government cares about cost. The previous administration also tried to overlay environmental onto that. But you'd be surprised actually in the U.S. because the way that construction is done on infrastructure, it's basically at a state level. So the federal government actually has very little impact on what's being built and how it's being built. It's the states, the 50 different states, that are the ones that say, use this product, not that product, on our highway or our bridge.
That in itself is fascinating because I remember discussion about the power of the states and the different ways in which states actually do have control over certain elements of the green agenda. But what I'm really hearing is that in our conversation, it almost isn't an issue who is in charge or what their agenda is. In the end, what all companies are looking for is something that works and is cheap.
And yeah, works, performs well, it's priced, at least, as you said, at the same price or hopefully a little bit less than the traditional materials. At the end of the day, a lot of the big vertically integrated cement and concrete companies in the United States are actually European.
Right.
So they haven't given up their focus. Lafarge Holcim, European company, CRH, European company, Heidelberg, European company. These are three of the biggest players in the United States, and they're very focused on decarbonizing their businesses. And they know the most efficient and effective way to do that is via the use of SCMs like ours. And so it's interesting because they're our biggest customers, but often they're our competitors as well, because they also want to develop these new sources of material to move into their system.
I mean, I think that's one of the challenges about all of the decarbonisation issues, that actually they cross lines and everyone has to kind of work together to a certain degree, even if they are in competition, because these challenges are too complex and too large to be solved on an individual company basis. So it's finding a new way of working together, I suppose. But from the sounds of things, that seems to work.
It has. And, I think, my personal view on it is that, everybody, for the most part, is rowing in the same direction, which is everybody realizes that, it doesn't really matter. Things can change from administration to administration. But long term, we are on a path toward greater decarbonization. It's not a linear path. It's going to go up and down and what have you. So, and people have different ways of doing it. But to my mind, and I'm a reasonably straightforward, simple person, if you've got a problem with a product because the product is too damaging, the simplest way for me is to use less of it, right? There are good alternatives, and there are, others as well, the vertically integrated players as well are going to invest a lot in technologies to reduce the emissions intensity of that cement that's left over, because as I said, that bar is not going to go to 100% immediately, right? It's going to take a long time probably to get there, so that you're going to have 30, 50, 60% cement left. So it's also helpful to make sure that that is as environmentally friendly as possible. And you can do that by using greener fuels at your plants. You can do that with carbon capture and sequestration. Very expensive and somewhat unproven, but a lot of the folks are definitely investing in those areas to try and say, we don't think that, that a significant portion of cement is still going to be required in a lot of stuff. So not only is there a big effort to use less of it, like what we're doing, there's also a big effort to make the amount that you are using less damaging.
Well, I think that's actually a wonderful note to end the conversation on. But the most important question I have to ask before we do is, what haven't I asked you about that you think I should have done?
Oh boy, that's a tough question. You've covered all the hot topics. I would just say, one of the interesting things is how the overall market in the U.S. is trending, and it's a lot of people don't really realize, but actually the last 18, 24 months, overall demand has gone down for materials. But one of the really exciting things about what we're doing is, while overall cementitious demand has declined because construction has been slower on residential, especially, and traditional office, even though there's more interest in data centers and infrastructure is strong. Interest rates are high, so people are building those things more slowly. Even though that's come down 5, 6, 7, 8% over the last couple of years, our SCMs, the greener stuff, has gone up and continues to go up. And so, we haven't suffered really from any of that weakness in the overall market, just because there's this huge gap between where we need to be from that percentage replacement level, what is just feasible today without even fancy technology, and how much material is available. And so that's why we're investing so much in new sources of this material, because we want to close that gap.
Yeah.
But the nice thing about that gap is that it gives us some protection against when we're in times like these, when the construction market is reasonably slow. I think it's a good story. As I noted, we look for win-win opportunities, and thankfully we've been able to find a lot of them. So we're going to continue pushing forward on that, and we're going to continue to, our goal is to double the number of materials that we recycle within the next few years. And just to give folks sort of an idea on scale, because people don't often think as much about it, we recycle 10 million tons a year of material, which is a lot. And actually, for pretty much every ton of material we recycle into concrete, we save a ton of emissions of CO2. And so I had my team look back to the year 2000, which is as far back as I could get data from our company and our predecessor companies. Since 2000, we've kept over 200 million tons of CO2 out of the atmosphere by recycling these materials. That's the amount of emissions that Argentina has every year. And so This is huge scale. It really is impact. And it's, as far as if you wanted to spend $1 and you wanted the most efficient way to reduce emissions, I would challenge you to find a more efficient way than doing things that we're doing to reduce those emissions. That dollar goes a long way, and it allows for really an efficient way, an effective way at scale to do what folks have been trying to do, for at least the last several years, and will be focused on for the next couple decades.
What I love about that is twofold. One is that's an excellent story for the company itself. It's an excellent story for the global atmosphere. But also, it's really interesting to look at what you're talking about the sort of dip in demand for cement, but the increase in demand for your product. Because what you're talking about is the potential for there being more headroom in doing things in a slightly greener way that maybe a number of industries have not yet looked that closely at. And the current turmoil could actually disrupt a lot of people's expectations about how certain companies are going to grow in comparison to others. So I think that could be quite an interesting model to start looking at. Well, listen, Grant, thank you so much for joining us today. It's been really interesting to listen to you talk and to get some perspective from the US on what's going on at the moment. And I wish you all the best for the future.
Thank you, Felicia. It was nice chatting with you, and all the best.